not quite sure what to say. Hey, and we have audio. All right. And I'm assuming we have pictures as well. So I guess we can start. It's about time to start. So we'll just dive in, and hopefully everybody will be able to join us in progress. Thanks everyone for being here in the auditorium, and thanks to everybody who is watching online. We are again in the book of Matthew. We are at chapter 27, and things are really, really heating up. We know that Jesus, we ended last week with Jesus being betrayed by Judas, and the mob takes him. Interestingly enough, before that happened, Jesus made two very interesting predictions, both of which came true. The first one was to his disciples, "You will all fall away because of me." And of course, that's exactly what they did. Peter included, who said, especially, even after they all to a man said, "Oh, we'll stand by you and we'll die with you and we'll die for you," they run for cover. Peter trails along, follows Jesus to the home of Caiaphas, the high priest, where the sham trial begins. And 3 times he's confronted and said, "Aren't you one of his disciples?" And of course, just as Jesus predicts, not once, not twice, but 3 times, Peter denies knowing the man. And the words are barely out of his mouth when the rooster crows, and Peter remembers Jesus' prediction. And one gospel records that at that very moment also, Jesus looks through the window and looks directly at him. And Peter goes out and weeps bitterly, ending chapter 26. So that brings us to the beginning of chapter 27. Keep in mind that this is the religious leaders, the ruling council, which is called the Sanhedrin, has been meeting through the night, figuring out what can we do to get this guy convicted and have at least a legal pretense for killing him, because that's murder is on their minds. Well, through the night, that meeting is technically illegal. Sanhedrin was not supposed to meet. So what they do is, chapter 27, verse 1, early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people made their plans how to have Jesus executed. Basically, they call an official meeting. For those of us who've worked in state government, you know, there are some things that cannot be discussed in a public meeting, or you can't reach a decision except in a public meeting. So what a governing board will do is, if they have to meet in executive session and they reach a decision or a consensus of what they're going to do, they come back into open session and say, "Okay, all in favor," and they vote. And that's how stuff like that is covered. This is kind of what's going on here. They have reached a decision. It's not yet legal. So to make it legal, they convene in daylight, which is the proper time for them to meet, and they reach their decision. All in favor, say aye. And they have a plan. And verse 2 says they bound Jesus, they led him away, handed him over to Pilate, the governor. The reason they do this is because even though they are a ruling council, the Romans will only let them do so many things. One of them they cannot do is kill people. For that, they have to go to the Roman authorities, which is why Pilate, the governor of the region, of the province, is brought in. Or they wind up bright and early in his palace, and Pilate, no doubt, is excited to see them not. But the scene shifts in Matthew's narrative, verse 3, when Judas, who had betrayed Jesus, saw that he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders. "I've sinned," he said, "for I have betrayed innocent blood." Well, that's the right motivation. He's feeling sorrowful. He's regretting having done what he has done. But he's not changing any hearts or minds. The chief priest replied, "What is that to us? That's your responsibility. Yeah, we were your partners in crime, but hey, don't go wobbly on us now. We've been able to do what we want to do, and we're not really worried about your change of heart." So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. You know, that his last act of contrition, or one of his last acts of contrition, is to throw the blood money back into the temple, as though to say, well, this is your money, you know, be as self-righteous as you want to, but you're in this with me. Then he goes and hangs himself. He comes to a sad end. You know, there are so many. Judas, rightly so, comes off very badly in the Gospels for what he has done. I have a personal feeling that he didn't necessarily have to be condemned to eternity. He always had that option of basically praying to God and saying, "Lord, I've sinned, please forgive me." I think if he had done that, he would have been forgiven. Of all the acts of contrition that we see here, that is the one thing that is not recorded. So I think it's safe to say he didn't do it. And in fact, John refers to him, or Jesus refers to him in the Gospel of John as the son of perdition, which means that the way Judas is going spiritually, there's no turning back. In fact, it's either in Luke or John where it's recorded that during the Last Supper, Satan enters Judas. And so Satan's in control. And of course, one thing that Satan is not going to do is going to let you go back and repent or have that kind of frank talk with God. So that's one of the dangers of consorting with the devil. That you're dealing with a power that is more powerful than you are. It's very difficult to walk away or to do something different. And so it's sad about what happens to Judas. There are more details in Acts chapter 1 as to how he meets his bad end. Basically, in fact, when you read the account in Acts chapter 1, it looks like it's two different accounts or conflicting accounts. Not necessarily so. Judas goes out and hangs himself. For religious reasons, no one touches the body, because if you do, according to Jewish religious rules, you become unclean, something you don't want to do during a religious festival. By the time someone finally gets around to saying, "Hey, we ought to do something about that dead body hanging on the tree," he's been there, he's been dried out. Basically, by that time, the rope finally gives way, and when it does, that's when he drops to the ground, and what is described in Acts chapter 1 happens. So basically, it's kind of like the rest of the story, not conflicting versions of what happened to him. But that's the end of Judas, but back to what's going on with Jesus and the religious rulers. As for Judas's money, verse 6, the chief priest picked up the coins and said, "It's against the law to put this in the treasury, since it's blood money." Hey, yeah, we used the money to help commit a crime, but we don't want to be associated with it. It's unclean. So as self-righteous religious officials, here's what we're going to do with it. So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That's why it's been called the field of blood to this day. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price set on them by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field as the Lord commanded me. And if you want to follow up on those Old Testament scriptures, check out Zechariah chapter 11, verses 12 to 13, and then also in Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, chapter 19, the first 13 verses, and again in chapter 32, verses 6 through 9. So that little bit of business is taken care of. Back to Jesus, who by the time Matthew picks up on Jesus' story, Jesus is back. He's appearing before Pilate the governor. In fact, in Matthew's account, this is Jesus' second appearance before Pilate. He's actually appeared once before him. Pilate sends him to Herod, and where Jesus visits with Herod, and then Herod sends him back to Pilate. And so, verse 11, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" You can kind of imagine how the tone in which Pilate asked the question, a little bit ironically, maybe a little sarcastically, because Jesus looks anything but a ruling king at this point. Jesus replies, "You've said so." When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer, which is amazing to Pilate because he expected Jesus to be protesting his innocence. Verse 13, Pilate asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony they're bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. And it's about this point in time, according to some of the other Gospels, where Pilate reaches a conclusion. Now keep in mind, this is not a defense of Pilate. He was not a good guy. He was probably as cynical and probably as ruthless a politician in the Roman government as you could get. But even Pilate is starting to figure out, why is he here? This guy has done nothing wrong. In fact, in Luke, Pilate is quoted as saying, "I find no fault in this man." So he starts looking for an answer, something that will resolve this little controversy in a teapot, basically, and to the satisfaction of everyone. Verse 15, "Now it was the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time they had a notorious prisoner, someone who was well known, whose name was Barabbas. Mark says he was an insurrectionist who had committed murder. We would probably think of him today, we would probably call him a terrorist. And probably rightly so. This was a guy who was rebelling against law and order, basically, who was trying to take down the ruling authorities. But essentially, he was a bad dude. So when the crowd had gathered, and again, keep in mind, these are all the Jews who've come in from all over the region to observe and to celebrate Passover, one of the really big Jewish holidays. When the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, "Which one do you want?" Okay. Test. Test. I can hear myself breathing. Okay. I think we have audio again. So just to summarize, Pilate sees a way out of this little religious mess that he'd rather have nothing to do with. And as clean, simple, and even bloodless, he says, hey, who do you want me to release to you? Barabbas, this awful guy, this terrorist that not even you Jewish folks would really want to have anything to do with. You certainly wouldn't want to have him over for supper tonight. Or how about this guy, Jesus, the Messiah, who basically hasn't done anything to offend anyone other than these ruling authorities. That's the subtext here. He's thinking, okay, common sense would say, hey, release Jesus. Done deal. Problem solved. Only it doesn't work out that way. The chief priest and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. Which of the two do you want me to release to you? Asked the governor. Barabbas, they answered. Interestingly enough, the name Barabbas sounds very, very much like the Greek word for son of the Father. So you have the choice, or the Jews are making a choice between someone whose name sounds like the Son of the Father and a man who actually is the Son of the Father. Interesting. And Pilate is very surprised by their choice. Yes, give us Barabbas. What shall I do then with Jesus who's called the Messiah? Pilate asked. They all answered, crucify him. Pilate is stunned. He said, why? What crime has he committed? But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. You get a little sense here of what the mentality of a mob can turn into. You can wind up saying and shouting and supporting pretty much anything if you're not careful. Absolutely, absolutely. I remember in my mass communication class, we talked about mob mentalities, and my professor just loved to bring up this little episode. There were about 2 or 3 episodes from the New Testament that he always loved to pull up and cite as examples. This is one of them, where it's the mob basically just turns mindless, and they're shouting whatever everybody else is shouting. And they basically, the mob becomes so loud that Pilate starts to lose control of the situation. Verse 24, when Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead of an uproar was rising or was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. For all we know, he might have bathed 12 times a day, but he's doing this little symbolic act here. I am innocent of this man's blood, he said. It is your responsibility. Well, nice try, Pilate. Actually, no. Pilate, at the end, he's doing a political thing. But if he really wanted to do the right thing, he just could have told everybody up front, look, there's no choice between these two guys. This Jesus here hasn't done anything wrong. I'm setting him free. Don't bother me. By the way, my office is closed for the rest of the day. But Pilate has some problems, because he never knows where he really stands with the home office in Rome, with all the political stuff that's going on, especially with the home office. You never know what your standing is. And the religious authorities know this, and they're using it to their advantage. Hey, Pilate, you better do what we're asking you to do. You wouldn't want to have word get back to Rome that you're supporting an insurrectionist like this revolutionary here who claims to be king of the Jews. So, Pilate says, what can I do? I can't do anything, but I'll basically show that I'm innocent of whatever bloodshed is about to occur. I tried. I did all I could. So he says to the crowd, it's your responsibility. All the people answered, his blood is on us and on our children. A really terrible thing to say. One more episode of showing how the mob just does not understand the import of what they're saying or what they're doing to or what they're agreeing to. But anyway, the deed is done. Verse 26, Pilate released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Now, what we're talking about here is this is a method of execution that was common in the Roman Empire. The Romans did not invent crucifixion. We can thank the Persian Empire for that. But what the Romans did was they improved it, if you can use such a word. They added a few special things, basically to hasten the execution and maybe add a little torture to it, including this little episode called flogging or scourging. There was a reason for doing that, and basically it was to soften up a crucifixion victim to the point where it would, essentially they would die more quickly, because otherwise they could spend days, maybe even weeks on a cross, suspended, if they were in really, really good physical shape. So the idea is by flogging, you beat them up, and you really do significant damage to their bodies. I'm not going to get into the gory details, but just sufficient to say, there were in some cases where crucifixion victims, some suffered so badly from a flogging or a scourging that they did not survive that. As it turned out, they didn't have to be crucified because they died from the scourging. So Jesus is beaten up pretty badly just by the scourging. In verse 27, after that, the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium, this is inside Pilate's palace, and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and then they twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand, then they knelt in front of him and mocked him. "Hail, King of the Jews," they said. They spit on him, took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. After they mocked him, they took off the robe and put on his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. It wasn't bad enough that he got physically tortured through the scourging. Before they send him away on the road to the cross, they go through this little mockery where they make fun of him. And they strip his clothes off. By that time, some of the blood has congealed onto his clothing. And so when they rip his clothes off, that opens up the wounds. They put this robe on him, not to honor him, but to mock him. The crown of thorns, which they press down on his head, that's more torture. They give him a mock scepter, which is basically a reed. And when they're through making fun of him, they strip off the robe again. Again, more stripping away of whatever scabs had formed and reopening his wounds. If that was not bad enough, then came this public march to the crucifixion site, which was outside the city walls. And regardless of who was being crucified, it was always a public event. The person to be crucified was led out, and they had a nice little procession. It was led by a centurion on horseback. The centurion was the guy who would be supervising the execution. And then behind the centurion was this herald who would be shouting details of the crime that the crucifixion victim had committed. The victim himself was forced to carry the crossbeam, basically the beam that would be nailed on the post that was in the ground. And that crossbeam in and of itself was a burden. It was like 75 to 125 pounds. And by now, Jesus' physical condition is such, he's so weak that he can't bear the crossbeam by himself. So verse 32, as they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene, that's in North Africa, a guy named Simon, who has come something like 800 miles from his hometown to be in Jerusalem for the Passover, and they forced him to carry the cross. They came to a place called Golgotha. The Latin translation of that name is Calvary. It means place of the skull because the physical characteristics of that hill kind of looked a little bit like a skull. There they offered Jesus wine to drink mixed with gall, and that was kind of a courtesy to basically anesthetize the victim so that they'd still feel a little pain, but maybe not as much, because it would dull the senses. Jesus tasted it, but refused to drink it. So Jesus goes to his physical death with his fully experiencing what's about to happen. When they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots, and inadvertently or unknowingly fulfilling one more piece of scripture in Psalm 22. And sitting down, they kept watch over him there, not to take care of, to take care of him, but in a very perverse way. The soldiers gathered there just to make sure that no one tried to rescue Jesus from the cross. It had been done before, where if you leave the victim hanging up on the cross, someone who really wanted to rescue him could do it if there were no soldiers around. So they keep watch over him. Above his head, they place the written charge against him. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. Not really to honor Jesus or to honor the Jewish people. In a way, the Romans were mocking the Jewish folks, as though to say, hey, here's the King of the Jews. He's beaten up, he's naked, he's exposed, he's near death. Is this the best you can do, people, for ruling authority? In fact, the chief priest and the other ruling officials protest to Pilate. What are you putting that sign up there for? We don't like it. And at that point, Pilate just basically says, shut up. I'm done with you people. You know, what I've done, I've done. That sign's staying up there. If you really want to read more about the details that the people underwent when they were being crucified, there actually was an article that was written several years ago. It's called On the Physical Death of Jesus Christ. It's by Dr. William Edwards. The Journal of the American Medical Association published that article back in 1986. And I remember my brother, the doctor, reading it and telling me about it. You actually can access it on the internet. It's 22 pages. It has maps. It has illustrations. Don't read it while you're having lunch, please. But if you want all the gruesome details, it's there. We just won't go into it. Just take my word, this was not a very happy way to die. Well, not only is Jesus by now nailed to the cross, but he's in between two robbers who were crucified with him. One on his right, one on his left. And whenever you had a threesome, the public consensus was that the guy in the center was the worst sinner or the worst criminal. Verse 39, those who passed by hurled insults at Jesus, shaking their heads and saying, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Remember, that was the accusation that was made against Jesus before the Sanhedrin. This guy came up and said he was going to destroy the temple in 3 days. Well, if you're going to do that, as they make fun of Jesus on the cross, he says, if you're going to do that, come down from the cross, if you are the Son of God. In the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we'll believe in him. It's the old trope that they threw at Jesus time after time after time. If you really are the Son of God, perform a miracle for us. Never mind all the other miracles, all the other signs and wonders you've already performed. We want another one. We're not totally convinced. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him. For he said, I am the Son of God. In the same way, the robbers who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. From the other Gospels, we learn that Jesus was crucified. The actual crucifixion where he was placed on the cross occurred about 9 o'clock in the morning. So for about 3 hours in the morning, he's there, it's bright sunlight, but around noon, something happens. Matthew records in verse 45, from noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. We're not talking about, sometimes when we, in the spring, when we have severe weather, we have these thunderstorms and these storm systems come in, and we get these intense rains and so forth, lightning, thunder. It really gets dark, the dark clouds and everything. And if you're in your house, it really does get dark. We're not talking about that kind of darkness. We're talking about total darkness, like in the middle of the night darkness. This is at high noon. Is this unusual? Well, keep in mind, this occurred during a full moon phase. And we know that because Passover has always been scheduled, and Easter, the Easter holiday, has typically been scheduled whenever there's going to be a full moon. What is it about a full moon phase? Well, for this kind of total darkness to occur, that could only happen if you're talking about natural events during a total eclipse of the sun. What happens during a full moon phase? It is impossible to have a total eclipse of the sun. So, what we're seeing here is a supernatural phenomenon where the sun, essentially, the light of the sun is blocked out completely. It's the dark of night in the middle of the day. And it lasts that way for 3 hours. Darkness, Matthew writes, came over all the land. About 3 in the afternoon, that would be the 9th hour in some of your translations, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's the opening verse in Psalm 22. As Jesus, as a rabbi, as one who grew up studying the Old Testament scriptures, would have memorized that psalm long, long ago. And this is something more than just a symbolic or a random verse that comes to Jesus' mind. Something is going on spiritually here, where, first of all, the phrase where Jesus is said to have cried out in a loud voice, loud to the point of yelling. Even in his weakened physical condition, he does this. Also, by quoting this verse, Jesus, this is probably the one time in the scriptures where Jesus is recorded addressing God without calling him Father. Every other time where he talks about God, he talks about God the Father. The term forsaken means that something really and literally is going on a level that we can't comprehend. God has withdrawn his fellowship from Jesus. He, at this very moment, he is regarding Jesus as a sinner. And we know that God, being the righteous God that he is, cannot abide the presence of sin. So there is this, there's this separation between God and Jesus in this moment. Where he represents, basically he's in a position of the sinner, he is fully experiencing the wrath of God. This was the cup that Jesus dreaded drinking. This is the cup of God's wrath that Jesus was referring to when he was praying to God a chapter or so earlier. Basically, what's going on here is the transaction that's going on. This is the sacrifice that Jesus is making. This is what Jesus is doing, is undergoing, so that you and I and everyone who claims the salvation of Jesus will never have to experience separation from God, experiencing the wrath of God. But back to what Jesus is saying on the cross, verse 47. When some of those standing there heard this, they said, he's calling Elijah. Probably because Jesus is quoting the verse in its original Hebrew. And if most or if all you know is in Aramaic, you're not catching the significance of what Jesus is saying. So what they hear is Eli, Eli. Oh, well, he must be calling Elijah. Immediately, one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him. And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. Note the use of the words here. First of all, he cried out again. Matthew doesn't say what, but John kind of fills in a blank here. John says, probably about at this point, he says, it is finished. In other words, what I came to do, I have done. I've completed it. Mission accomplished. And then after saying that, Matthew says he gave up his spirit. Unlike other crucifixion victims. How did those victims die? Well, essentially, they either died of shock because they lost so much blood. Their bodies got to the point where their bodies just couldn't function anymore and they shut down. Or they lapsed into unconsciousness from which they never recovered. Or they suffocated. Because the way you were situated on the cross, you had to lift yourself up to breathe because your body was compacted. And every time you lifted yourself up, you made yourself weaker and weaker and weaker until you got to the point where you were too weak to breathe. So you suffocated, or you bled to death, or your body basically had suffered one big shock, physical shock, and shut down. If you were lucky, you just basically passed out and never revived. That didn't happen to Jesus. He was still alive, fully conscious, fully in control of everything. In fact, in John chapter 10, verses 17 and 18, Jesus said, I lay down my life that I may take it again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down by myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. When Jesus knew that he had done what was necessary, what he had come to do, he said, I'm giving up my spirit. He chose to die. And that's exactly what happened. Nature didn't overcome him. His enemies didn't literally kill him at that moment. He said, at this point, I'm ready to shut down. And so he does. He gave up his spirit. When that happens, three things happened. Verse 51. At that moment, the curtain of the temple in Jerusalem, this beautiful temple that everybody was just so proud of, the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Not just torn in two, but it was torn from top to bottom. I don't know the exact details of how this particular curtain was put together, because this is like the second version of a formal temple. This was probably at least the third version of the temple veil. Basically, the what we're talking about here, the temple or the veil the curtain that guarded the entrance to the Holy of the Holies. That was the area where only the chief priest could enter, and only once a year. Any other time, he'd be put to death if he misbehaved while he was inside the Holy of Holies. If he did anything wrong, he could be put to death. God would see to it. But that curtain was separated the holy place of God from the rest of the temple where the other priests convened. That curtain was torn in two from top to bottom. The way that curtain was knitted together or put together, it would have been impossible for human hands to tear it apart. How did it get torn? God did the tearing. And again, from top to bottom, basically sending that message, I, God, am doing this. Not only that, Matthew writes, the earth shook, the rock split, a massive earthquake hits Jerusalem. So much so that the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. By the way, we have this supernatural darkness and the earthquake are recorded not only in the Bible, but there are secular sources that talk about these two phenomena occurring. So we have witnesses. So you have the earthquake, you have the temple, the curtain in the Holy of Holies being split open. You've got these men of God who've been long dead being raised to life, going into town, going into Jerusalem. Verse 54, when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, surely he was the Son of God. This is an amazing thing for someone like a centurion to have said, someone who is basically so hardened by life. Probably the last person you would ever see get religion. But this is what he says. Surely he was the Son of God. He got it almost right. Just the verb tense. It would have been more correct to say, surely he is the Son of God. Matthew continues, many women were there watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee to care for his needs. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. That would be a reference to James and John. Of course, if you've been watching any episodes of The Chosen, you're familiar. And this is one of the things that I appreciate about that series is that when they show scenes of the disciples getting together, they do show men and women. And because, as Matthew says here, there are women who had supported Jesus during his ministry. So we're going to end on that note. There's a few more verses of chapter 27, and then there's an ending chapter. If you were basically talking about the life of Jesus purely from a secular perspective, this is where your story would end. But as Paul Harvey might say, there's the rest of the story. We're going to pick that back up in 2 weeks. Next Sunday is going to be our special service with a combined class. But we'll meet back in 2 weeks to finish our study of Matthew and see how this story turns out. I hope you got something out of the lesson today, even with the technical difficulties. Anyway, thanks for listening and watching, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. In the meantime, have a wonderful week.